The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the television studio, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Technicians moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting cameras, testing microphones, and ensuring every angle would capture what was meant to be a carefully orchestrated display of family values and political solidarity. The show's producers had pitched this segment as a ratings winner, a rare glimpse into the personal side of one of America's most polarizing governors. Kristi Noem arrived at the studio 45 minutes early. As was her habit, her media team had drilled the talking points into her memory: family first, conservative values, strong leadership, and the importance of passing principles to the next generation. She wore a navy blazer that photographed well under studio lights, her blonde hair styled in the signature look that had become as recognizable as her political brand. Everything about her appearance was calculated, from the subtle flag pin on her lapel to the pearl earrings that suggested both strength and femininity. Her daughter Kennedy arrived separately, driven by a different aide. At 24, Kennedy possessed the same sharp intelligence that had propelled her mother to the governor's mansion, but where Kristi's eyes held the steely confidence of someone who had learned to control every room she entered, Kennedy's carried something else, a weight that seemed to press down on her shoulders like an invisible burden. As they sat in the green room, the tension was palpable to anyone paying attention. Kristi reviewed her notes one final time, occasionally glancing at Kennedy, who sat quietly in the corner, staring at her phone but not really seeing it. The makeup artist noticed that Kennedy's hands were trembling slightly as she applied the final touches of powder. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," Kristi said, her voice carrying the tone she used when cameras were rolling, even though they were still in private. "This is going to be wonderful, a chance for people to see who we really are." Kennedy looked up, and for a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a question, perhaps, or a challenge, but she simply nodded and said, "I hope so, Mom." The host, veteran broadcaster Mike Reynolds, had built his career on these kinds of intimate interviews. He specialized in drawing out the human side of political figures, the moments that made viewers feel connected to the people they saw on their screens. He'd interviewed presidents and paupers, celebrities and criminals, but something about this particular segment felt different. During the pre-interview, Kennedy had been unusually quiet, answering his questions with the bare minimum of words. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them, he had told his producer earlier that morning. He couldn't have known how prophetic those words would prove to be. The studio audience was small but engaged, mostly consisting of political supporters and local media representatives. They had come expecting the usual fare: anecdotes about family dinners, stories about teaching children the value of hard work, and perhaps a few humorous tales about the challenges of raising teenagers in the governor's mansion. As the cameras began to roll, Kristi was in her element. She spoke eloquently about the importance of family, about how her children had kept her grounded throughout her political career. She shared carefully selected memories: Kennedy's high school graduation, family vacations to the Black Hills, quiet evenings reading together. The audience was charmed, exactly as her team had hoped. "Kennedy has always been my greatest source of pride," Kristi said, reaching over to squeeze her daughter's hand. "She's intelligent, compassionate, and she has a moral compass that never fails to amaze me." Kennedy smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Reynolds, trained to notice these subtle tells, leaned forward slightly. "Kennedy, what's it like being the daughter of such a high-profile political figure?" "I imagine it comes with unique challenges." It was meant to be a softball question, an opportunity for Kennedy to share a light-hearted story about life in the public eye. Instead, Kennedy paused for what felt like an eternity, looking directly at her mother. The studio fell silent except for the barely audible hum of the camera equipment. "It's complicated," Kennedy said finally, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent that made everyone in the room pay attention. "You grow up thinking your parent is this amazing person who can do no wrong, and then you get older, and you start to see things differently." Kristi's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. She tried to laugh it off. "Well, I think every parent can relate to that. Children always think they know better than their parents. But Kennedy wasn't laughing. She was looking at her mother with an expression that was part sadness, part determination, and part something else entirely, a look that suggested she was about to step off a cliff and take everyone with her. "Mom," Kennedy said, her voice cutting through the studio's carefully controlled atmosphere like a knife through silk. "Why did you do it?" The question hung in the air, deceptively simple, but loaded with implications that no one in the room could fully understand yet. Kristi's media training kicked in immediately, her face maintaining its composed expression even as her mind raced to understand what her daughter was asking. "I'm not sure what you mean, sweetheart," Kristi said, but her voice had lost some of its warmth. She was no longer speaking to the cameras. She was speaking to her daughter, and the millions of viewers could sense the shift. Kennedy took a breath, and when she spoke again, her words were measured and deliberate. "I've been quiet for so long. I've watched you build this image, this brand. I've defended you when people questioned your decisions. But after everything, after that chapter you wrote, I can't stay silent anymore." The reference to the memoir was unmistakable. Kristi's book had been a bestseller, filled with stories of her rise to power and her philosophy of leadership. But it was one particular chapter that had generated the most controversy: her casual description of killing the family dog, Cricket, because it was deemed untrainable and had behaved aggressively. The story had ignited a national firestorm. Critics on both sides of the political aisle had condemned it as evidence of callousness, a disturbing glimpse into the mind of someone who could justify violence against a defenseless animal. Kristi had defended the decision as necessary, a difficult choice that demonstrated her willingness to make hard decisions. But what the public didn't know, what Kristi had never mentioned in her book or in any interview, was that Cricket had been Kennedy's dog. Not just a family pet, but Kennedy's constant companion throughout her childhood. The dog had slept at the foot of her bed for years, had been there for birthdays and Christmas mornings, had comforted her through the awkward years of adolescence and the stress of growing up in the public eye. "You wrote about Cricket like he was just some problem to be solved," Kennedy continued, her voice beginning to shake with emotion. "But he wasn't a problem to me. He was my best friend. He was the one constant in my life when everything else felt chaotic and overwhelming." Kristi tried to interject, to regain control of the narrative. "Honey, I know this is difficult, but sometimes as leaders, we have to make hard decisions." "No, Mom," Kennedy's voice was firm now, cutting through her mother's attempt to politicize the moment. "Don't spin this. You didn't do that as a leader. You did it as yourself. You wrote about it in your book like it was a moment of strength, a lesson in leadership, but to me, it was a moment of betrayal." The studio was completely silent now. Even the camera operators seemed to have stopped breathing. This wasn't a prepared segment anymore. This was real life happening in real time, and everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Reynolds, despite his decades of experience, found himself at a loss for words. He had hosted contentious interviews before, but nothing had prepared him for this. A daughter confronting her mother about a deeply personal betrayal in front of millions of viewers. Kennedy's composure began to crack, and the pain she had been carrying for months finally began to show. "You remember when I was 9, and I found that injured bird outside? I wanted to help it. You let me nurse it for days. You said, kindness is strength, but now I wonder if you still believe that. Because the woman I see now uses strength to justify pain, and I don't recognize her anymore." The words hit Kristi like a physical blow. For a moment, her carefully constructed political persona completely fell away, revealing the woman underneath, a mother who suddenly realized that her daughter saw her as a stranger. "You don't understand what it's like to lead," Kristi said, her voice breaking slightly, "to carry the weight of every decision, every backlash, every criticism. I've had to make choices that I never wanted to make, but they were necessary." Kennedy leaned forward, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. "Maybe I don't understand leadership, but I understand the weight of disappointment. I understand what it feels like to look at your mother and see someone you don't trust anymore. That weight is just as heavy." The confrontation wasn't just about the dog anymore. It was about years of accumulated grievances, about watching her mother transform from the woman who had raised her into a political figure, who seemed to prioritize image over integrity. "It's not just about cricket," Kennedy continued, her voice gaining strength. "It's about the laws you've signed. It's about what you've said to women in this state. You talk about protecting life, but you've created a system where a 13-year-old girl raped by a relative would be forced to give birth. You call that morality. I call it cruelty." The political implications of Kennedy's words were staggering. Here was the governor's own daughter, on live television, criticizing her mother's signature policies in the most personal terms possible. It wasn't a policy debate. It was a moral indictment from someone who had once looked up to her mother as a hero. Kristi looked stunned, her media training completely inadequate for this moment. There was nowhere to run, no talking points that could save her. Her daughter had brought the nation into the kitchen table conversations that most political figures hide from public view. "I know I've disappointed you," Kennedy said quietly, "because I won't toe the line, because I don't clap for every bill you sign. But I'm not here to be your cheerleader. I'm your daughter, and daughters don't just follow. They question, they care, they remember." The interview that was supposed to last 30 minutes stretched on for nearly an hour. But it felt like both an eternity and an instant. Kennedy continued to speak, her words carrying the weight of years of suppressed frustration and disappointment. She talked about family dinners where political strategy was discussed more than homework or dreams. She described the isolation of being the governor's daughter, how difficult it was to make genuine friendships when everyone wanted something from her family. She spoke about the pain of watching her mother's approval ratings rise even as Kennedy's respect for her fell. "I've tried to talk to you about this privately," Kennedy said, her voice becoming more vulnerable. "I've tried to understand your perspective, to find common ground, but you don't hear me. You hear a political problem to be managed, not a daughter who's struggling with who her mother has become." Kristi, for her part, seemed to age years in the course of the interview. The confident politician who had entered the studio was gone, replaced by a woman who was finally being forced to confront the cost of her ambitions. "I love you," Kristi said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've only ever wanted to make you proud." Kennedy's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "I know you love me. I love you too. But love doesn't mean silence. Sometimes, it means speaking up. Sometimes, it means saying the things that are hard to hear." The interview ended not with a resolution, but with a question that hung in the air like smoke. What happens when the person you once looked up to becomes the person you must stand up to? In the hours that followed the broadcast, the nation was transfixed. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from praise for Kennedy's courage to criticism of her decision to air family grievances in public. Political commentators struggled to analyze the implications of what they had witnessed. Kennedy's statement on social media was simple and unpolished. "I didn't plan to do it that way, but I couldn't stay quiet any longer. I love my mother. I always will. But love doesn't mean silence. Sometimes, it means speaking up." The post gained millions of views within hours. It wasn't about political alignment anymore. It was about honesty. About what happens when personal morality collides with public authority. About the courage it takes to speak truth to power, when that power is wielded by someone you love. Kristi's team issued a brief statement praising open dialogue between family members and underscoring her commitment to making difficult decisions with courage. But the governor herself didn't comment directly on Kennedy's words. Sources close to the family revealed that tensions had been simmering for months. That Kennedy had tried multiple times to speak privately about her concerns, but felt unheard. The interview became a cultural touchstone, referenced in op-eds and academic papers about political families, generational conflict, and the cost of political ambition. It raised questions about the children of politicians, about the sacrifices they make and the voices they surrender in service of their parents' careers. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated that even the most powerful people are not immune to the judgment of those who know them best. In Kennedy Noem's voice, Americans heard their own questions about leadership, about truth, about what it means to stand for something when it costs you everything. The silence that followed that final question was louder than any applause or outrage. It echoed not just in the studio, but in the homes of viewers across the country. And for many, that silence said more than any politician ever could. In the end, the interview wasn't just about a family dispute, it was about the price of power, the weight of conscience, and the courage it takes to speak truth when silence would be easier. It was about the moment when a daughter chose her principles over her family's political future, and in doing so, reminded the nation that sometimes the most important voices aren't the ones with microphones, but the ones who dare to speak the truth, no matter the cost. The story of that day would be remembered not for what it revealed about politics, but for what it revealed about the human heart, its capacity for both love and disappointment, its ability to hold both loyalty and truth, and its power to change everything with just a few carefully chosen words.